Tonight on Primetime Politics, international trade and interprovincial pipelines. Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe weighs in on the Prime Minister's U.S. strategy and tells us about his role in federal energy talks with Alberta. Also,
the aggressor must pay fully for the war he started.
Talks aimed at ending the Russia-Ukraine war are ongoing, but is there any hope for a deal that Ukraine can accept? We hear from Ihor Michalchyshyn of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress. And
the UN is in a moment of crisis.
Bob Rae spent 5 years as Canadian ambassador to the UN. Now he has more to say on what needs to change there and where Canada fits in this global moment. This is Primetime Politics. Hello, I'm Andrew Thompson with you tonight. Michael Serapio is on assignment. The Prime Minister says he'll speak to Donald Trump again when it matters, that there's no burning issue. It's a message Conservatives are zeroing in on as they pressure the government on tariffs. First, take a listen to what Mark Carney told reporters yesterday, and then how those words were playing out in the House this afternoon.
Who cares? I mean, it's a detail. It's a detail. I spoke to him. I'll speak to him again when it matters. I look forward to speaking to the president soon, but I don't have a burning issue to speak with the president about right now. When America wants to come back and have the discussions on the trade side, we will have those discussions.
Mr. Speaker, it's the Prime Minister who said, "Who cares?" when he was asked just over the weekend about the failure to keep his promises on trade since he took office. Not only has he failed to get the promised deal, but American tariffs on aluminum, autos, and steel have doubled. On forestry communities, they have tripled. The Prime Minister says, who cares? All of us on this side of the House care about the communities that are being emptied out in our forestry, the steel workers in Hamilton who don't have jobs to pay their mortgages. We care about those people. Why doesn't he?
Just because the Leader of the Opposition keeps repeating the same line over and over again doesn't make it real. Mr. Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition knows very well that our government was elected to defend Canadian workers and the Canadian economy. That's exactly what we did in a budget that was tabled in this House of Commons. The opposition decided not to support Canadian workers.
And joining me now on this is the Premier of Saskatchewan, Scott Moe. Premier, good to see you.
Good to see you, Andrew.
Now, I do want to start on the Canada-U.S. question because we have the Prime Minister saying he doesn't have a burning issue to speak about with the President right now, that they'll speak again when it matters. Do you agree with that mindset?
Well, obviously, we'd like to get to, a point of agreement sooner rather than later, not only with the U.S., but, somewhat indirectly China, as well as we now see tariffs in India, and those are our three largest markets from our province's perspective, and I think in fairness from Canada's perspective as well. And so our role has been to support the Prime Minister and the federal government in any way that we can in order for us as a nation to get to those negotiating tables sooner rather than later. The fact that negotiations broke off a couple of weeks ago is disappointing. We hope to get back as soon as we can, but there's also a time when it's appropriate to get back. I hope that's soon, but I support the Prime Minister and the strategy that he's taking to that table on Canada's behalf. We need him to be successful, not only from Saskatchewan's perspective, but from each of us as Canadians' perspective as well. We need to come together, as a team, as Team Canada, in finding our way what is pretty challenging time the last bit here.
Now, you were in Washington recently on a trade mission, meeting members of the Trump cabinet. There is talk of the Prime Minister potentially going there. Does the Prime Minister need to go back to D.C.?
Sure. and they're our largest trading partner. And, we would encourage the Prime Minister and members of his cabinet to be in Washington more than than certainly we have been over the last decade. And I am seeing a commitment from this Prime Minister to really increase Canada's credibility in the international stage, and that includes in Washington, D.C. So we would hope that he would be there sooner rather than later, and we'd hope that Minister LeBlanc would be able to return to the negotiating table as well sooner rather than later. And I think in our meetings in Washington, there's an understanding that we are going to have to, work together to find a path forward. There's probably still some sensitive conversations to be had on certain industries. So.
All right, let's turn to energy and pipelines, because last week you said you were involved in talks between Alberta and the federal government. Can you clarify just what exactly Saskatchewan's role has been in these talks as they've been ongoing?
Yeah, we wouldn't be, a direct signatory or anything to any type of an agreement that might come forward. However, we very much are supportive of Premier Smith's moves to become the proponent for this project and start to bring the conversation forward. And two, on behalf of Prime Minister Carty, we commend him for being open to having discussions around, some unconsulted policies that came into place under his predecessor that simply are unworkable and are hindering us achieving his aspiration of not only becoming a global energy superpower, but obtaining or getting to a point where we'd have the strongest economy in the G7. In order for that to happen, we need to be, as provincial premiers and as a federal government, supportive of each and every project in each and every industry in each and every province. And we certainly are supportive of all the projects that we see that may be constructed here, whether they be in British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, or any other province across the nation. And I think that is what it truly means to be on Team Canada, is for us to support all of the projects regardless of where they are in the industry they're within.
Okay, so just to clarify then, did the Saskatchewan government have a tangible seat at the table in these talks, or was it more of a support role?
So there is no secret talks. There's a decision that the federal government will be making, likely under the guidance of Alberta with respect to what needs to change, and I would say to some degree Saskatchewan as well, as the guidance that we've provided as it pertains to the energy industry likely aligns very closely with what Premier Smith has been discussing with Prime Minister Carney. And so, like I say, we wouldn't be any direct signatory to this particular project, but we're highly supportive of it for multiple reasons. One, it's going to bring a higher price per barrel of oil to every barrel of oil in Canada, including the ones in Saskatchewan. Two, opens up some additional capacity for us to send our product in Saskatchewan south, which is a positive. We can expand our industry here. And three, it really would help with some of the capacity on the West Coast, some of the efficiencies in a Northwest Coast port, where we might be able to have realistic discussions about, for example, expanding or twinning the rail line to Prince Rupert, which would allow us then to attract investments and send more products to that port as well. We see, very recently, Canada's largest mining company that is saying that it's a pretty challenging environment for them to consider investing in port infrastructure on Canada's west coast, and are looking, quite likely to the United States of America. That should cause us pause as Canadians, that we need to be more welcoming and providing more certainty with respect to those types of investments on our west coast.
Okay, you mentioned the West Coast and Prince Rupert. I do want to ask you about the BC Premier in the time we have left with you, because David Eby said he learned about these talks through the media. He says that was unacceptable. Do you understand the frustration he has about how this process has played out?
Certainly. When Bill C-69, or the Environmental Impact Assessment, was introduced, Saskatchewan and Alberta were not consulted. When the tanker ban was introduced, Saskatchewan and Alberta were not consulted. When the emissions cap was introduced, Saskatchewan and Alberta were not consulted. Consultation didn't happen in any of those cases, and it had a huge impact, each of those policies, on how we create wealth in our respective provinces. That being said, when it comes to interprovincial pipelines, we all know very well, and I'm sure the NDP Premier in British Columbia knows very well, that this is a federal government's decision. However, there is a lot of work to come between now and when that decision might be made with respect to engagement of all of the communities, community leaders, and Indigenous and otherwise along that route. And there is, if we truly are going to be serious in looking for a private proponent to come forward, there are some of those unconsulted laws, like the emissions cap, that are going to have to change. And I think that is very much the discussion that Saskatchewan has brought forward, and I see that discussion being brought forward by Premier Smith as well. Again, I would say we're supportive of all of that happening. We're also supportive of the LNG projects in British Columbia as well. We're supportive of expanding TMX, and having conversations around how we can not KXL anymore, but how we can have increased access to the United States of America through that type of infrastructure as well. This is not an either-or conversation, as the NDP Premier in British Columbia is framing it. This is an all-of-the-above conversation, and we need to have these discussions if we're going to truly achieve some of the aspirations that the Prime Minister has.
All right, Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe, appreciate your time as always.
Thank you very much, Andrew.
Ukraine's allies are expected to gather virtually tomorrow. Their meeting follows talks between the U.S. and Ukraine aimed at ending the war with Russia. President Donald Trump says something good may be happening. And the president of Ukraine says his country will keep working with partners, including the U.S. But Volodymyr Zelensky also says the main problem remains Russia wanting recognition for stealing land.
We all continue working with partners, especially the United States, and look for compromises that strengthen but not weaken us. And we will continue explaining how dangerous it is to pretend that aggression is something one can simply overlook and move on.
All right, well, for more on the Ukraine talks, let's bring in Ihor Michalchyshyn, who is CEO of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress. Mr. Michalchyshyn, good to see you.
Thanks for the invitation.
So I want to begin with framing the conversation this way. When the initial details of that 28-point U.S. draft plan was filtering out last week, the UCC posted on social media that appeasement always leads to more aggression. After the talks that you've seen happening over the last 48 hours, are you still seeing this process as what essentially amounts to appeasing Russia?
That was our reaction to the 28 points that were initially were being reported or being leaked as they were. And there was a lot of discussion on whether those were American drafted or Russian drafted. From what we could see, that they were many long-standing points that Russia had been wanting in terms of Ukraine's surrender and territorial concessions and future concessions in terms of security. So, I mean, our line is absolutely that appeasement is not peace. Appeasement and occupation are not peace. That, it is very difficult to envision a deal that Vladimir Putin will agree to or adhere to that wouldn't allow for a continuation of escalation in the near future.
Right, because we have seen European officials saying that there have been some significant changes to the American proposal. We have a joint U.S.-Ukraine statement saying that the talks have been constructive and productive, that any future agreement must fully uphold Ukraine's sovereignty and deliver a sustainable and just peace. When you hear that kind of language, what's your reaction? Does that give you any sense of optimism?
I'm optimistic that the international reaction to the initial 28 points has been consistent and unified, both including the Canadian and European coalition that's responded to it and the leadership that has come forward on it. The fact that Ukraine is now part of the discussions is the most important part, that's always been their main point and our main point, that discussions about Ukraine cannot happen without its participation. That shouldn't be negotiated around. We're down to today, on Monday now, 19 points, and there's an interplay between Kyiv and Washington with a potential meeting later this week. So I think that is positive, an engagement and a reaction to the extreme concessions is a positive step in what we hope will be a peace process. But again, we're not hopeful that Russia will actually come to the table. Russia has not signed any ceasefire negotiation, as the Ukrainians have, and has not even endorsed officially this 28 or whatever number we're at peace plan.
Right, we've seen a suggestion that, for instance, that this idea of keeping Ukraine out of NATO has been taken off the table. How significant is something like that? What do you see as the real big stumbling blocks when you look at the specific points in the proposals, whether it's about NATO, whether it's about the size of the Ukrainian army, whether it's about Ukraine's allies having some kind of role in Ukraine once the war is stopped?
I mean, these are not new concepts. Russia has been floating these concepts for years, even before its full-scale invasion. So I think the Russian success in legitimizing these and putting them back on the table in a formal way is what we're the most concerned about. That these are not. This is part of Russia trying to maneuver its imperial future in terms of how it will regain, in its view, control over Ukraine and the rest of Eastern Europe and rebuild its USSR-like empire.
Right, because we did have the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, saying today that Vladimir Putin wants legal recognition for what he has stolen.
Absolutely.
And that's the main problem. So do you see that, point of recognition of that land, of that territory, being a real key red line for what Ukraine would be willing to accept here?
There's many red lines here, but I think from the beginning, non-recognition of the Crimean invasion, then the eastern Ukraine and Donbass. I mean, Putin is seeking recognition and legitimacy. And unfortunately, the Russians are trying to exploit divisions within NATO, within the European Union. They have some allies there who are trying to drive wedges in between those who are allies of Ukraine. And they are having some success. And on days like this, when we are restarting those conversations on the basis of the key Russian concession points, that's a success for them. So unfortunately, it's almost back to square one. But again, I would say it's a bit of a Groundhog Day in the sense of we've seen these processes before. We're glad to see that Ukraine's allies, along with Ukraine, are reacting strongly and able to provide some sense of perspective and legitimacy in terms of what the next step should really be.
Right, and certainly Canada has been one of those allies over the past 3 years. So I do want to ask you about the Canadian response over the last few days. Are you satisfied with what you've heard from the Canadian government as these draft plans have come out, as these negotiations have been happening?
We are. We've seen Prime Minister Carney participate both in direct conversations with President Zelensky and then as part of the coalition of the willing and other groups of leaders that are supporting Ukraine in this, particularly from the European Union, but not exclusively. So we know that Canada's voice in those talks is important and carries a lot of weight both in Ukraine and internationally. And so we expect that to continue, and we're pleased that that is a legitimate and positive role for us to be playing.
Okay, and I do want to ask, because you represent Ukrainian Canadians, as Ukrainian Canadians look at the Canadian response, but also just this wider story, this potential deal, different points being put forward by the U.S., by Ukraine, by European allies. Is there a sense that Ukraine is being forced into a deal? I guess I'm looking at what the mood is of Ukrainian Canadians right now as they watch all this unfold.
I would say partially our mood is one of watching what happens every night. So every night, last night across Kharkiv, last week across Ternopil and Kiev, we see Ukrainians being killed by Russian drones and attacks. That's the most immediate reaction that we have, that we see a continuation of that violence on civilian populations, unending violence, at a time when these negotiations are taking a lot of the oxygen out of the headlines. So we are, Canadians are desperate for a peace, as is Ukraine, but not peace at any cost. And again, as I said, occupation and concession and surrender is not peace. And so we are very determined to support the Ukrainian government and Ukrainian people in a just peace that recognizes the aggressor as Russia, the war crimes, the kidnapping of children, the genocide that's been committed and documented and well understood. And I think that this is all part of a Russian game to divide the American administration against itself, to divide the American people, versus all of Ukraine's other allies. And we've seen this before, and we are glad to see that Canada and others are stepping up to intervene at this point.
Okay, we'll leave it there. Ihor Michalchyshyn, CEO of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress. Thanks a lot for your time on this.
Thank you.
Bob Rae's time as Canadian ambassador to the United Nations came to an end earlier this month. He spent more than 5 years in the role, a time that included more questions about the UN's future and its very relevance. And so with Rae's farewell speech came a warning.
The UN is in a moment of crisis, and we don't need summer soldiers and sunshine patriots. We need countries that are going to be all in. Doesn't mean you have to be all in to say everything's wonderful, or that we agree with everything the UN is doing. It means in order to make change, we all have to be contributors to change.
And we have Bob Rae joining us now. Mr. Rae, thanks for taking the time.
Great to be with you.
Now, we are going to talk about your time as ambassador and that last speech you gave, but I do have to ask about the developments happening in Europe in recent days. Of course, the talks to potentially end the Russia-Ukraine war. Do you think that there's a chance of something tangible that Ukraine can accept this week?
Well, we'll just have to see. I think the question really is not just on the Ukrainians, it's on the Russians as well. I mean, if the Ukrainians have already accepted the principle of a ceasefire. So if you wanted to see an end to the fighting, there's only one country that has to say yes, and that's Russia. Because Ukraine has already said they're prepared to stop fighting and to start from where they are, the ceasefire line being where it is, and have a strong negotiation with the Russians. But that's not what's been proposed. So the word ceasefire doesn't actually appear in the document. So we need to understand that there's still a lot of work to be done to get us to where we need to be.
And so what do you make of that original proposal we saw from the United States, that 28-point plan? Do you agree with those who essentially see it as repeating Russia's own demands?
Well, it comes pretty close to being the Russian position. But again, I don't think it's really, there's a whole lot worthwhile in going in, for me to go through in detail. Lots of experts have analyzed the document and have pointed out its shortcomings in a variety of ways. I think the critical thing is that the Americans, the Europeans, and the Ukrainians are finally talking, because this was not, as opposed to President Wilson, who talked in 1917 about the importance of having open arrangements openly arrived at. The arrangement is not open, and the process of getting there has not been open. So we need more transparency in the discussion. And there's got to be no more surprises, and we've got to get to the point where nobody's saying it's my way or the highway. It's got to be a discussion that looks at the choices and the options, none of which are easy. But the essential thing is to try to get to a way of stopping the killing without abandoning all our principles. And I think that's the key point.
Okay, I do want to talk to you about the United Nations and the principles of the UN, because in your speech, you said that the United Nations is in crisis. What is the crisis as you see it?
Well, I think there's really two, and they're really huge. The first one is a financial crisis. I mean, there's much less money coming in than is required for the UN to do its job, and so the UN has had to lay off. And I say the UN, I mean the whole system, all of the system, has had to lay off tens of thousands of people, and it is doing much less than what needs to be done in a whole number of areas, and many programs have been cut completely. And this is not receiving enough attention in terms of the impact that it's having, particularly on developing countries. So the financial problems have to be solved by the UN becoming more efficient in how it operates on the one side, but on the other side, there has to be adequate funding. So that needs to happen. But there's an even bigger problem, and that is that there's a sense, I think, in the world that the UN is not able to do all the things that the global population wants it to be able to do. And the problem is the charter, the way the Security Council has been set up, a lot of things don't really allow that to happen. So rather than just throw up our hands and say there's nothing we can do, we have to look at within the existing frame, and also broadening the frame a bit, how can we actually make the UN more effective and ensure that things can get done which ought to be done. And that requires a lot of change of behavior on the part of member states, but in particular of the most powerful. And I worry that the big three, China, Russia, and the United States, seem to have a very different vision of how things should work. And they very much want to see things work as they want them to work and say everybody else has to go along with what we do. So we have this tension between a strong desire for multilateralism, strong desire to make the international system work, and the view of some countries that no, it's going to essentially be the game where the most powerful decide what's going to happen and everyone else just has to sit back and take it. And I think that's a bigger debate than just a narrow debate over finances.
So where do you think Canada, as a middle power, then fits into that debate? You have now a successor at the UN, David Lametti. How do you think he's going to be able to navigate that kind of geopolitical situation where, as you say, you have the U.S., Russia, and China now really looking beyond multilateral bodies and really just engaging in more head-to-head talks?
Well, it's not just head-to-head talks; it's head-to-head fighting. I mean, you've got the possibility of China doing something terrible in Taiwan. You've got, which is still a possibility we can't ignore. You've got the Russians in the most bloodthirsty way attacking Ukraine, and the United States doing some things, one could argue, in terms of tariffs, in terms of some of the other unilateral actions that they've been taking. Going well beyond the framework of what most of us would see as international law, international commercial law with respect to tariffs, international law with respect to how countries are supposed to conduct themselves. And I think that's the real challenge. It's of course it's secret agreements secretly arrived at, which is the opposite of what much of the 20th and 21st century was supposed to be about. But we've also got a huge problem with the way in which the world is working. What can we do? Well, actually, there's a lot we can do, because there's a whole lot of countries, most of Africa, Asia, Europe, most of the countries of the world want the system to work differently, and they want it to work in a more constructive way. So we have to work hard with all of those countries, not just Western countries, but countries around the world in doing that. And I think that's something Mr. Carney really tried to do when he came to New York in September. He broadened the scale and scope of the dialogue with a number of countries, linking it, of course, to our own interest in greater trade and commerce because of the relationship with the U.S. at the moment, but also really working hard to get other countries' initiatives moving forward on climate change and on a whole bunch of issues. So Canada, I think, remains firmly internationalist, firmly committed to multilateralism, and firmly committed to reform and change and pragmatic improvement in a situation right now which cries out for pragmatic change. And I think that's what Mr. Lametti also believes in. I've had many chats with him about things, and I think he's going to be a great representative for Canada at the UN.
Now, I will ask about Canadian foreign policy, though. You talked about multilateralism. The recent budget does contain some cuts to foreign aid, returning it to a pre-pandemic level. Does that concern you? Do you see that at all? Is Canada potentially taking a step back in its global commitments at this moment?
It concerns me, but on the other hand, it's concerned me for several years that not just Canada, but several other countries have been, I would say, nibbling away at the edges in terms of what an international commitment there should be. I don't worry about our broad sense of commitment and engagement at all, but I do think that every country, including Canada, has to be aware that we're not going to solve the world's problems with less. We're only going to solve the world's problems with more. And that means more ideas and vision, but it also means a greater financial commitment. So to that extent, yeah, I wasn't happy with that aspect of the budget, but there are many other features of the budget that I thought were necessary. So I mean, we are cutting back on expenditures, and we're supposed to be increasing investments. I just think we should be looking at a lot of the stuff that we do globally is really an investment in our own security and in our own future. And I want to see us have a robust defense, diplomacy, and development budget that continues to look at the ways in which we can make change happen. But I know that there'll be a lot of discussions going forward about how we can make that happen.
All right, we'll have to leave the conversation there for now. But Bob Rae, want to thank you again for your time tonight.
Thank you. Good to talk to you.
And that is Primetime Politics for Monday, November 24th. I'm Andrew Thompson. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.